The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Ed Crooks joined Wood Mackenzie in 2019. Based in New York, he covers the full range of commodities, technologies, and sectors, with a particular focus on climate policy, economics, and the energy transition. He writes Wood Mackenzie's popular Energy Pulse newsletter, analyzing the latest developments in the world of energy, and also hosts the Energy Gang podcast, one of the world's most popular energy-focused podcasts. Now let's get into the episode with Ed. Welcome back, Dave.
Lysandra, it is great to be back, and I'm sad to say that our good friend from the UK is going to really miss this event because the guest we have today, a fellow countryman of John's, I think, and so we'll look forward to have this chat with Ed.
Agreed. Today we're joined by Ed Crooks, Vice Chair of Americas at Wood Mackenzie and host of the Energy Gang. Welcome, Ed.
Thanks very much indeed. Great to see you. Thanks very much for having me on. I have to say I'm kind of a little bit nervous about this. This is usually me on the other side of things. I'm usually asking the questions, so I just hope I can be a good guest.
I'm sure you will, Ed. You not to worry at all.
Ed, that's how I feel when Dave and John flip the questions on me. I'm like, I'm not used to answering these ones. So on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the power of thought leadership. And as the host of the Energy Gang podcast, how do you see your role in shaping the discourse around critical energy topics? And what unique perspectives do you believe you bring to the table, given your extensive background in journalism and economics?
I mean, what we try to do, I guess, is to be totally fact-based. It feels like energy is an area that is quite ideological and politically charged in lots of ways, in lots of directions. Just as an anecdote here, so I'm, as you can possibly tell from my accent, I'm not a native New Yorker, but I live in New York now. In my early days of living here, I saw on our TV station, we get a lot of ads for New Jersey, and there was an attack ad aimed at Chris Christie, the governor. Someone was challenging him there. Said, Chris Christie, he's wrong. He's not a good guy for New Jersey. He supports liberal energy. I thought, well, that's kind of, that seems a bit weird. What is liberal energy? And of course, everyone knows exactly what that means, right? It means he supports renewables and so on. But the electrons don't have party registration cards, it's all energy. And I mean, as I say, so I felt that was understandable, but also problematic. The idea that the discourse about energy is, as I say, has this kind of political spin in it all the time. So I would say one of the crucial things that we try and do on the Energy Gang is get away from that to be kind of non-ideological, kind of totally fact-based. So that's one thing. I think another thing we try and do is be very kind of relevant to what's going on at the time. This is a very fast-moving industry. It changes a lot. There are changes in economics, in technology, in policy and politics as it affects energy, changes in international relations, changes in markets, all of these kinds of things. And we're really trying to keep listeners up to date with the latest developments, the latest thinking in all of those areas. And to say to people, might think you knew about this industry and what was happening here, but if your knowledge was derived from 6 months ago, well, hang on, actually, quite a lot has changed since then, and this is what's changed, and this is what's important. So that's another thing I think it's important to us. And the third thing I think is bringing people a diverse range of voices from across entire, I hate that term, the space, like real management consultant jargon, talk about the energy space. It always grates on me, but then I always find myself doing it because I can't quite think of an alternative. But in other words, the energy industry plus policy plus academia. We have some fantastic academics who are regulars on the show, plus banking, investment, finance, and so on, and try to get, as I say, a kind of a broad range of perspectives on the issue from a number of different people. And that question of broad range of perspectives, I think, is very important. We can probably go into that maybe in a bit more detail later on. But sorry, I've talked enough, I feel like. But those three things anyway. So fact-based, topical, and diverse in viewpoint are the three things I think that are really kind of important in what we try to do. Oh, and I can tell you one more thing, though, but just before I stop, which is there was a great thing I heard. I think it was actually, I don't know if you want to get into the history of the Energy Gang, but that's kind of an interesting story if you want to talk about that. And so I think this may have been a commentary on an earlier incarnation of the show. But what somebody said about it in a review once, which I thought was a really nice way of putting it, said, imagine you're at an industry conference and you're in the lunch break. And during that lunch break, there are three people on the next table who are kind of gossiping amongst themselves about, all the latest things that are going on in the industry. And you get a chance to eavesdrop on that conversation. That's what the Energy Gang is like. And I think that's a fantastic aspiration to have. I think it's a great way to think about it. We don't necessarily always achieve those heights, but that's, the goal. When we think about what we're trying to do, I think that's a really important way to think about it.
And for all our listeners, the Energy Gang podcast is one of the top podcasts in the marketplace. And so I'm really pleased to have you here. I want to pick up on what you said about the podcast benefits and how it actually engages, and it's so timely. So I'm curious, I know we're going to get into a lot of stuff, probably off script, by the way, but what are some of the things that feedback you're getting from your listeners on some of the topics that you're covering? Like, what are you hearing? What do they want to hear more of? What don't they want to hear? I'm curious how that has rolled out.
I would say one thing that people are particularly interested in a lot of the time is technology, and technology in the sense of kind of interrogating it closely and not being a booster for anything. And I think, it's something that you get quite a lot in this industry, and I think it's something you get quite a lot often in to use that dreaded word space, something you get quite often in conversations about energy, which is, this is the new silver bullet, this is the thing fantastically exciting, this is the thing that's going to make all the difference and change the world. And being prepared to kind of that and look into things closely, clearly, and to be realistic about them. That's one thing that is very important. And then conversely, just to flip over to the other side of things, we also don't want to fall into the trap of being too negative. And again, in terms of feedback from listeners, what this is like. If you have a podcast, you always have people that criticize you from one direction and also from exactly the opposite direction. So sometimes people say, you're kind of too negative and you're too down and everything and you're raising all these criticisms and objections. Or then you also have people saying, you're not boosting things up enough and Sorry, you're not being negative enough and you're not challenging people as aggressively as you should. And so getting that balance right is difficult. But so I think, as I say, the lodestar is being realistic, kind of looking at technology and saying, these are the technologies that are genuinely exciting, are real changes happening here. There is a lot that's going on. Also, you have to acknowledge there are real challenges and also ways to surmount these challenges. And these are not we're not saying this is kind of insuperable obstacles, but you have to be clear about what the difficulties are. And so, as I say, that's one of the things I think we think about a lot when we're talking to our listeners and hearing from our listeners is getting that balance right.
One of the things our objective was certainly to inform the marketplace, because as I think you're conveying, there's a lot of misunderstanding and decisions are made not with really good data or understanding that. And so technology is a key part of the industry for sure. And I'm curious because I like markets, and I think that's an issue that I think most customers in the energy industry, there's technical people and there's people in the markets, but the two don't actually understand each other. And so then decisions don't get made as well as they could if they were integrated. So are you getting any feedback from people that are in, I guess, policy, but also in markets, talking about market conditions and how to make the markets better and more effective as well? Is there any demand or requirement in those type of podcasts?
Definitely, and that is something that a lot of people want to hear about, and it's something we do try and kind of bring to people often. And again, I wouldn't say they're the majority of our listeners, but quite an important constituency among our listeners is people who have an idea that they're looking to get financing for. And so the question of, how the markets work and how flows of capital work is very important to them. And that is something I hope I can bring a bit of a perspective to, because I'm an economist by training. And as you will know, economists are not always popular and often get criticized, and engineers in particular will kind of say, you guys just completely misunderstand what's going on here, and have no real grasp of the things that we're doing, which essentially is fair. But also I think that about economics, understanding a bit about markets can bring very often a useful perspective to the debate, which is not fully understood by engineers often. And if, as you say, you need both sets of perspectives to be brought together, and that's one of the reasons why we try and hear from a range of voices on the show, is to try and bring those various different perspectives. Sometimes in the discourse, as you say, when people get led down blind alleys and into poor decision making, sometimes it's because they're not thinking about the economic perspective enough. And so that's definitely something we try to bring to the debate.
I totally agree. Yeah, I like you. So John Pooley, who's not here, is an engineer, but I have economics background too. And so we have this kind of yin and yang approach, which I think goes quite well, but I think it's as you conveyed, and we're both in the same mindset. Of course, we're going to agree with each other that economics is really important, and it really would be helpful in doing that. But
yeah, as you say,
thank you.
As you say, it's a shame that John isn't here, because now we're just having groupthink. You and I are now mutually just agreeing with each other that economists are fantastic. It's always good
to hear what John says about this.
Exactly. Whatever perspective you have, it's always good to challenge it.
That being said, I want to be careful, because actually Lysandra's an engineer. So Lysandra, you can pipe in here and speak up on this too.
I'm in disguise right now, as you can see. I was very quiet during that conversation. Ed, something I like that you highlighted, and it's something that we focus on in this podcast as well. And honestly, being an avid podcast listener in general, I think as humans, the scariest thing is to get comfortable with your thoughts. And I think we try to diversify thoughts by highlighting those different guests that have different perspectives, so that we're not tunnel visioned on, our views and what we think is the best way. And I think you've kind of echoed that with how you do it at the Energy Gang. So I think it's always great to talk to, different professionals in the energy space and get everyone's point of view.
Absolutely. And the thing I always go to, one of my favorite notes or is philosophy, something not exactly an economist, but definitely economist adjacent, John Stuart Mill. You know this line about John Stuart Mill, which is he used to pray for the quality of his opponents. I used to pray that I have the best possible quality of opponents, because that way I win either way. Either people argue against me and I'm convinced by their arguments, and actually I realize that I was mistaken, and so my error has been corrected, and my knowledge is better than it was before. Or I defeat their arguments, I'm not convinced by them, but then I know that my ideas are as strong and as solid as they can possibly be, because I've been able to refute the best possible arguments against them. I think that's a great principle. And that, again, it's an ideal that probably we don't always hold by, most people don't, but it's a great idea to have that, I think, as your kind of lodestar, which is the strongest possible arguments against your position that you can think of. Steel manning it, as they say, sometimes the opposite of straw manning. I think that's a really valuable approach and a great way to think about things.
No, that's great. Through your hosting in the Energy Pulse newsletter, you've created platforms that blend technical insights with broader economic trends. How important do you think it is to make accessible explanations on topics that are seen as complex, such as climate policy and energy markets?
It's funny. I mean, I think about this in a couple of ways, in that, so I wear two hats. As you introduced me at the beginning of the show, so I'm Vice Chair in the Americas for Wood Mackenzie, which I'm sure is familiar to many of your listeners, but in case it isn't, is energy research and consulting firm, national firm, whatever it is, about 2,000 people around the world that we've got, and covering sort of everything, oil and gas and power and renewables and metals and mining and so on as well. And with that hat on, we are communicating to our clients, who on the whole are people working either directly in the energy industry for energy companies, or are interested in it because they are investors in the industry and so on. And we're providing with data and analytics. That environment, it's a very clued up, a very knowledgeable audience, people who will understand an enormous amount about the industry. That's more than I do, maybe. We'll have these discussions, and so when you have those conversations, you always need to be absolutely sure that you know what you're talking about. Then it's true in a sense of the Energy Gang, which is that it's clearly an audience who will be interested in energy and often do work in the industry as well. And certainly I meet a lot of listeners who work in the industry in various ways, but might be just people with a casual interest, or might be people perhaps who are, students and aspire to work in the industry one day and that kind of thing. And so there, it is super important, I always think, to be clear and absolutely kind of transparent in everything you're saying as much as it is possible. And obviously, this is an industry which is, full of jargon, full of technical terms, full of, complicated units. And then there are sort of other areas that have sort of related sets of jargon. So I've just been at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, and you get into that world, the number of different, 3-letter acronyms for different parts of the UN process, how the NDC is going to relate to the SDGs, and what does that mean for the new NQCD? Again, it quickly becomes extremely opaque and difficult for people to understand, and I'm sure kind of off-putting to a lot of listeners, but also kind of pointless. And so that is something that I think is hugely important. And so, just on the kind of the basic level, always getting people to spell out those kind of acronyms is really important, to explain technical terms, just to try and kind of convey everything in plain English as much as we can, I think is absolutely vital. And I think that's something that is really important kind of for us as a show, but also, as you were saying, just in terms of your contribution to the discourse, it just really helps to have a general public that is as well informed about energy as they can possibly be, and that stops people seizing on things that are going to be misleading and lead to bad outcomes. So, I used to work for the Financial Times. I was a journalist for a very long time. I was 20 years at the FT. And, one of the things we used to think about was, what's your ideal reader? So the same for podcasting, right? It helps to have an idea of your ideal listener. For a lot of us at the FT, it was basically an American banker working in banking who will probably be kind of, very smart person, very kind of up about a few things, probably very expert in their own industry, but won't know about everything in the world and won't understand Japanese politics or the workings of the UN climate mechanism, the workings of the auto industry. And so it's kind of that principle of how can you explain the technicalities and the important principles of something to someone who doesn't really think about that stuff very much at all, generally in their daily lives, and give the information to them in a way that they find useful and productive and engaging. As I say, so how we used to think about it at the FT, that's how I think about it now still at the Energy Gang. And again, partly because, of course, the energy industry is so fragmented. We talk about energy as if it's all the same thing. If you're a solar power developer, you really don't think about the oil futures market very much, and, vice versa. And if you're a copper miner, you don't think about king technology and, how that works very much. And so we try to make it a broad church, try to cover the waterfront in terms of everything that's relevant to energy. And therefore, we have to assume that a lot of the listeners, a lot of the people in the audience won't have technical specialized knowledge about the subjects we're talking about.
I want to pick up on that. And because I have worked in the energy industry and energy suppliers, I would say, just to reinforce what you said, like I was in a large electrical utility and then I worked in the natural gas, and the culture is extreme different. Yeah. But they couldn't really, they would look at the other side of the equation. Like if you're in the gas market and you look at the electric guys, you go like, who are those guys? I can't figure it out. And then the gas guys would do the same thing to the electric guys. It's a culture they just couldn't figure out. And I think in this transition that we're going through, and I know we're going to get into this, it's critical that we all understand that it's energy. It's not just electricity. It's not just gas. It's like there's a variety of things, right? And so that's why I really like the idea of podcasts and your podcast, of how it actually educates people so they start becoming more familiar with it. Where I want to go with this, and you actually started this at the very beginning, can you share with our audience the history of your Energy Gang podcast, like how it started, and then Just if you could share with us how it's evolved in the years that you've been doing that. Would you be able to do that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the podcast was actually started by three completely different people. It was started by Jigar Shah, who you may well know. I mean, certainly maybe familiar to many of your listeners, who's sort of very big figure in American clean energy. He now runs the program office at the US Department of Energy. So he's kind of providing financial support for carbon energy developments of all kinds, US. So interesting job. And he's a great sort of personality, very interesting thinker on energy. He's very active on social media. If you look him up there as well, anyway, so there was him, there was a couple of other people, Stephen Lacey and Catherine Hamilton, and the three of them, they were the original gang. And sort of for various reasons over time, they all left. Jigar got his job in government, had to go off and do that. Then Stephen and Catherine left. So we kind of had a podcast with nobody to run it. And then because I have a sort of journalistic background, and actually I have a broadcast background as well. In my very dim, distant past, I used to work for the BBC. I was on BBC Radio 4 quite a bit as a economics journalist there. So I got voluntold, as they say. That's a new expression I was just learned recently, which I thought is a very good way of putting it. I was voluntold that I was going to have to do it. And I have to say I have grateful that I was told to do it, because it's been a fantastic thing to do, and it's just such a great experience. I mean, it's great fun to do, as you'll know, I'm sure, it's podcasting is a lot of fun, but also it's fantastic both to meet the range of people that we have on the show, and my mind to a whole lot of different ideas, open me to being able to meet a whole lot of people that I probably wouldn't have otherwise got to meet, and also having that connection with the audience and getting the feedback from people and so on. That's tremendously rewarding. And I'm, as I say, I'm sure you know this as well, but it's always just great when you meet someone who listens to the show and who likes it. I had a good experience talking about Jigar Shah. So I met someone the other day who said, "Oh yeah, the Energy Gang, yeah, it's great. Really like your show. I think it's fantastic." They sort of thought for a bit. He said, "Yeah, it's not as good as it was when Jigar Shah used to do it." And then I said, and then he sort of said, but you have to. I mean, it's still really good. It's just not. I said, yeah, okay. I said, "Oh, first, fine. I'll take that. That's enough of a compliment for me." But my point being, meeting people, talking to them, talking to listeners, hearing their views is a great part of the job. And so, as I say, I've just been very kind of grateful for having been given that shove into doing it, because I think it's worked out really well.
I would echo that. Like, I would say we talk quite frankly, Lysandra, myself, and John, and the things we learn, like we get a real wide variety of guests. We don't have a position on, what you should do or what you shouldn't do. So we're open-minded, but the things and the people we have, you learn so much. I always joke that it's actually one of the best jobs anyone could have, because you're learning all the time about new things that you go, "Whoa, I didn't know that."
I also think we have some guests that come on regularly, like every year, and even seeing how our guests' perspective change. These are experts in the industry, and they come back a year later and they have a completely different perspective. Especially for me, when I tend to be more on the listening side of those episodes, I really get to analyze and see how these people who are experts in their industry still see the ability to grow and still see that their perspective can change based on new information. So I always find that really inspiring. And we've had a few where I'm like, whoa, their perspective has changed a lot in 365 days. And I think it's a good example for our listeners too, right? To constantly have that growth mindset.
100%. I think that's a fantastic point. And that's something similarly, exactly the same as you. I love that about bringing people back, and, they can talk about their experiences, and they're saying, well, I've been talking to so-and-so, and, this is what, I've been working on this project, I've done this research, I've made this investment, and this is what I've learned from that. This is what I'm hearing, this is what I'm picking up, this is what's changing my mind. And for them then to bring that back and to talk about that on the podcast and to be able to share that, me to hear that, and for me to learn from it, and then from our listeners to be able to learn from it as well. Yeah, that's super important. I love that.
Agreed. And podcasts, thank God, are accessible internationally. So we typically have a wide range of listeners, as I'm sure you do. Given the rapid evolution of global energy markets, how do you leverage your platform to connect U.S. trends with the broader global developments? And what value do you see in making these connections for your listeners?
Yeah, it's super important. And like you, we have a global listenership, and we do definitely try to be accessible again, back to that point about communicating with people clearly. We try to make sure that anyone anywhere around the world will be able to listen to our show and what's going on. We do tend to have a tilt in what we do. We have most of our listeners in the US, or certainly, the US is our number one country. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Partly that's sort of tradition. It's just grown up as a US show. That's where I know the most people, and I know the most people to come and join me on the show. And partly because where so much is happening, right? It's been not anymore a one country that's driving energy industry globally. I think you could make the case that's China these days, but still the US is up there. And also in that combination of having an extremely strong fossil fuel industry, largest oil producer, world's largest natural gas producer, world's largest exporter of LNG and so on, plus what is still a very, very strong and dynamic low carbon energy industry as well. The US is still a really important place, and a lot of people around the world clearly are very interested in hearing about what's going on here. I think as we think about how the podcast might evolve over time, one of the things I think we should be doing is getting more global voices in. And it's something which we've done a bit, and I'm very pleased to do it. Someone we had on one point, for instance, is Linus Mofor from the Economic Commission for Africa. So presenting an African perspective on energy, which is really kind of fascinating and often very, very different to the kinds of views that you'll hear expressed typically in North America and Europe. So that's very valuable. I was saying that I was just at COP29 in Azerbaijan. One of the people we've had on the show is Raquel Moses, who runs something called the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator, which is helping low carbon energy projects find financing in the Caribbean. And it's just so interesting to talk to someone who doesn't have that sort of North American, European developed country perspective, whole different set of challenges that they've got, been very, very relevant for all kind of COP29 debate. I don't know how much you followed that. Actually, as we are speaking, the talks are still going on. It's possible by the time the show is broadcast, they'll have concluded, although who knows what the outcome is going to be. But the big issue there has been climate finance, and that's been the thing that everyone's meant to kind of agree a deal on. And it's been the case that, all the news coverage you read and all the podcasting and all the kind of discourse around it, climate finance, people talk about that all the time without really properly drilling down into, well, what exactly is climate finance? What does that mean? What is the significance of it? What does it mean to the countries where that finance capital might be deployed? So talking to someone like Moses from emerging economy, just to get a completely different perspective on that, to really be able to explain, this is what climate finance means for us, this is the significance of it, this is why it could really make a difference on the ground in specific projects that people are trying to develop in the Caribbean right now. It's fantastically powerful. I think that's a really valuable service to be able to bring that to our listeners. So, as I say, when I think about perhaps what we should be doing more of in the future, that would be definitely is thinking more about those kinds of global perspectives. Again, going back to that point about groupthink, I think is always damaging. Getting diversity of views, wide range of opinions is always super important. I think we could probably do more of that.
Thanks, Ed. This has been a great episode on the power of thought leadership. To end off this episode, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
The biggest takeaway, obviously, is they need to listen to The Energy Gang. That's .com/podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, as well as the 360 on Energy and Carbon. I wouldn't suggest people listen to us instead of you, but when they've listened to all of your episodes and they're looking for somewhere else to go, they should come to us. And, I mean, as I say, going back to that point about the debate is really important, having an informed relation industry, in the wider industry, kind of the attached industry, and just in the general public at large in terms of voters and consumers, shareholders. That's very, very important. These are complicated and difficult and fast-moving issues, and many different viewpoints that can provide valuable perspectives and bring useful information to the table. So it's very important to hear from all of those viewpoints. And as I say, so that's my takeaway, which is people should be consuming as much information as they can bear about these things, because it really helps to have an informed population. And the more we can kind of tell people about what's going on, the better. I think the better the outcomes will be.
Agreed. Thanks for that, Ed. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think the issue here, or the opportunity, and I think Ed's conveyed this, and I hope we've done the same thing, is having the knowledge and diverse knowledge. So, Ed, I would encourage our listeners to listen to your podcast as much as ours or anyone else's, because I think the more knowledge and diversity of hearing of different expertise, I think it just creates this education so people can make better decisions. It's my belief we're in this industrial revolution right now, and I think energy is the key part of that industrial revolution. So people, if they're not knowledgeable about it, I fear businesses could be left behind. So I believe, the role that the Energy Gang, ours and other podcasts it's a media that people can consume, and they can consume it anytime, as opposed to reading a newspaper, which I'm not sure many people do. I'm of the age that I like reading papers, but I don't have a lot of time. So a podcast is a great thing. You can, whether you're going for a walk, you're in the car, you can consume it all the time. So I think that just the diversity and hearing different expertise is really important. And I thank you for being on this podcast with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me on.
All right. Thank you both. Have a great week.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ed.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.